Sam, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hans. And it's a real pleasure to be joined today by my co-presenter, Sofie Defour from Transport and Environment, who will, well, we'll be a tag team today. So you'll hear from me first, then from Sofie, then back to me, then back to Sofie. So that should keep things lively as we go through our presentation. So today we're here to discuss the proposal by the European Commission for what we're calling EU ETS2. So this is a new emissions trading system covering road transport and buildings, and the presentation today will explore its role in decarbonising those sectors. Of course, the Academy is an Electrification Academy. An ETS does not distinguish between electrification and other methods of decarbonisation. However, it's fair to say that electric vehicles and heat pumps are expected to play a key role in the decarbonisation of these two sectors over the next decade, and the EU ETS2 will have its role if it's voted through in achieving those. So next slide, please, Hans. So look, here's the outline for the presentation. So first of all, I'm going to explain what the proposal is. So this will take a little bit of time. It's important to sort of set the scene. Then I'll hand over to Sofie, who'll present on the implications for the transport sector, back to me to discuss the building sector, and then we'll finish on the use of the revenues and addressing equity concerns, because this is a really key aspect of this proposal, given its implications, particularly for lower income households. So next slide, please, Hans. So first of all, let's discuss the EU ETS2 proposals. Next slide, please. So I think the first thing to say, it's quite an important point really, is that the emissions trading for road transport and buildings proposal is just one element of a vast package of different directives, regulations and initiatives that form the Fit for 55 package. So this is a package that's aimed to reduce the EU's emissions to a net 55% below 1990 levels, and also put us on track to meet net zero by 2050. And it's really important to think of the ETS2 as just one element of that, because it really doesn't make sense on its own. I could pick out any number of these, the Climate Social Fund next to it, which is going to be one use of the revenues. And at the bottom, well, in the middle there, we've got the effort sharing regulation. So member states will still have their own national targets covering the road transport and building sectors, among other emissions. So next slide, please. So thinking about the rationale for ETS2, I mean, there's obviously a fundamental rationale for carbon pricing, in that internalizing the external cost of carbon emissions into the market prices faced by producers and consumers satisfies the polluter pays principle. And the Commission has previously tried to do this through the Energy Taxation Directive, so bringing in a carbon price through this particular directive, but it failed, owing in large part to the unanimity required across all member states to vote on taxation issues. The ETS is a regulation and doesn't have this unanimity requirement. So it is easier to bring in a European-wide carbon price through a regulation such as emissions trading system. Now this slide attempts to show, with a series of boxes that do not correspond with actual emissions, how the ETS and the ETS2 relate to the buildings and road transport sector and other emissions in the economy. So if you just do a click for me, Hans, we can see that actually a number of the emissions from buildings and road transport are already covered by ETS1, and these are the ones that come through electricity use indirectly in households and through electric vehicles, but also through some district heating systems, which where the installations are large enough to be covered by ETS1. So already there was an imbalance between those emissions that already had a carbon price and those emissions that did not. And we're looking for people to move from emissions that are not covered by ETS1, i.e. from coal, gas, oil for heating and for transport, to emissions that already do have a carbon price in ETS1, i.e. through the use of electricity or district heating systems. So there's a fundamental imbalance there, and that gives a rationale for bringing in an ETS in these two sectors. It's worth also saying, have another click here, please, Hans, that there are other sectors such as industry, small and medium-sized enterprises in the industry sector and the agricultural sector that are currently covered by member states' effort sharing regulation targets, but will not be part of this new ETS2. And this was for various reasons, particularly on the industry side. They felt that the bureaucratic aspects of being part of an ETS were too large to ask small energy intensive industries to partake. And then there are other emissions, the last click here, please, Hans, on this slide, which fall outside both member states' effort sharing regulation targets and the current ETS1 in land use change and forestry. But to complicate matters even more, overachievement in that sector can bleed into member states' effort sharing regulation targets. All that is to say that it makes analysing ETS2 quite complicated when one wants to try and work out what the prices might look like in the ETS2 going forward. Next slide, please, Hans. So a second reason that the Commission gave in their communications around the recent announcements related to the fact that emissions in the buildings and road transport sectors have been rising. So over the last 5 years, for which we have data, emissions in buildings have risen by 3% and in road transport by 6%. And I think the Commission felt that member states just having targets wasn't a sufficient driver to bring emissions down in these sectors, and that actually having a physical cap on emissions, which is what an ETS does, would be a much firmer instrument to actually drive emissions down. So next slide, please, Hans. So how is this new ETS2 going to be designed? Well, the regulated entities, so these are the entities that will need to submit their allowances to cover all of their carbon emissions, are upstream fuel suppliers in the gas, oil and coal sectors. The cap in the system will reduce to 43% of 2005 levels by 2030, which is in line with the modelling that the Commission have done about each sector's relative effort required to meet the 2030 targets. It'll be operational from 2026, so for the last 5 years of the decade, but with a requirement to hold a permit from 2025. 100% auctioning of allowances, so that differs from the current ETS, where a number of allowances are allocated for free, particularly to energy intensive industries at risk of carbon leakage, although that is proposed to change over time with the new carbon border adjustment mechanism proposal. And there's also a market stability reserve, so 600 million allowances will be taken out of the cap at the beginning, and these will be allowed to be fed back into the system if prices rise very quickly. Next slide, please. Okay, the second part of the design is what's called the soft start. So there's a whole bunch of things that have been put into the design to enable the scheme to launch smoothly. So the first thing to say is that the carbon budget, so this is the area underneath the cap, is looser than the expected emissions according to the Commission's modelling. So that means that there should be more allowances than are needed to cover their expected emissions between 2026 and 2030. Now, of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that'll be, that will happen if there are more emissions, because perhaps the ETS2 is not as effective as we think, and perhaps the other supporting policy measures are not as effective as we would hope, then the price could potentially rise much more quickly the market stability reserve could be exhausted, and this could become extremely problematic. But it also highlights the need to ensure that the other policy measures alongside the ETS2 are designed in a way that ensures that emissions are driven down. Other aspects of the soft start is that there's a front loading of allowances in 2026. So essentially more than 130% of the cap in that year will be released onto the market, so flooding the market with allowances. And the trajectory of the cap declines a little bit more slowly until 2028, and then speeds up a little bit from 2028 to 2030. Next slide, please. The final part of the design picture is super important, and that's about the revenues. So member states get to keep the bulk of the revenues, and there are some requirements about how those revenues shall be spent on decarbonisation projects and or social aspects. So some of the revenues can be spent on transfers, essentially, to cope with some of the equity concerns. We're going to have more on that later in the presentation. Some of the revenues will go to the EU's own resources. It's not known exactly how much, potentially 20–25%, which would go to what's been called a social climate fund, which would be funds reserved for vulnerable households and small and medium-sized enterprises. And finally, there's a small amount of allowances, 150 million, that are being put aside for the innovation fund, although it's debatable how much of that fund would be spent on measures in the buildings and transport sector, given the scope for innovation is perhaps a little higher in the industry sectors. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to pass over to Sofie, who is going to introduce the implications for the road transport sector. Over to you, Sofie.
Thanks, Sam. And Hans, just saying that I'm not able to start my video, but I will just get started. So indeed, I'll talk a little bit about the impacts or the expected impacts from the new ETS for road transport. But before I do that, I thought it might be interesting to just give a quick overview of what kind of climate laws exists today for road transport at EU level, and also, since this is the Electrification Academy, to give you a bit of a snapshot of where we are in electrification for road transport. So in terms of what exists today, basically you have two big regulations. On the one hand, you have national climate targets for 2030 for a set of sectors. So this covers road transport, buildings, agriculture, small industry, and waste. And it's kind of up to the member state to decide how much effort they do in each of these sectors. But all these sectors together at EU level need to reduce their emissions by 40% by 2030. So this regulates road transport emissions. And then a second big EU regulation is the car, van, and truck CO2 standards. And what these do is they sort of set pollution limits on how much a car maker's fleet can emit. And the idea is that we are going towards an ICE, an internal combustion engine phase out in 2035. So as of 2035, you can no longer sell any fossil fuel cars. CO2 standards sort of gradually bring us there. But now the Commission has, as Sam has explained, next slide please, Hans, proposed two new regulations for road transport. So this separate emissions trading system and the EU social climate funds. Next slide please. So before we talk a bit more about carbon pricing for transport, why is electrification important for road transports? Well, this slide shows a comparison between the efficiency of direct electrification, which is on the left-hand side, hydrogen through fuel cell, which is in the middle, and on the right-hand side, you can see the efficiency of using liquid hydrogen to fuel your car. And what you can see here is that both from well to tank and from tank to wheel, there are lots of efficiency losses along the way. But if you start with 100% renewable energy, electricity at both of the three options, then in the end, it's clear that on the left-hand side, the efficiency of direct electrification is really way off any hydrogen-based solution. So this is why for cars, electrification is really the way to go. Next slide, please. So how are we doing with this electrification of our car fleets? Well, actually, it can speed up, but it's going pretty well. We've had an impressive growth in both 2020 and also in the first half of 2021, for which we already have numbers. So what you can see here on the left-hand side of the slides is the share of EVs in new market sales across EU countries. And so you can see on the left side that we've got like the Scandinavian countries over there. We've got the Netherlands with very high shares of EVs in their new car sales. And then the shares are a bit lower as we move to the right-hand side of the graph, where you have Central and Eastern European countries. But actually, what you can see in the light blue, sort of the lines that are on top of the bars, these show the growth in EV market share. So what you can see is that while these Central and Eastern European countries might not have that big of a market share yet, they are growing expansively. So we're moving into the right direction. And a big reason for this is that in 2020, car makers needed to reach an EU target for their fleet under these car CO2 standards. Next slide, please. So the previous slides showed us a snapshot of where we are, but where are we heading? How is electrification planned to progress over the coming years? Well, we did a study together with Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and it turned out that electric vehicles will actually reach price parity. And then we're talking about the upfront purchasing costs of an electric vehicle with fossil fuel alternatives in 2025 to 2027. And the reason why there's a bit of a range between this 2025, 2027 is that it depends a bit on the model. But across all major models between 2025 and 2027, the price will be the same as if you want to buy a new petrol car. And the main reasons for this are the decreasing costs of batteries, but also the fact that we're moving towards mass production of these EVs. So car CO2 standards, EU car CO2 standards have really created this mass production that drives down costs and makes cars more affordable. Next slide. Thanks. So how are these car CO2 standards now planning to progress in the coming years? So after we reach price parity? Well, what you can see here on the graph is in black, the black line shows the proposed car CO2 standards by the Commission in its Fit for 55 proposal. And what you can see is that it performs under what the market would be doing anyway, which is the blue dotted line. So actually the market-driven growth in electric vehicle share of total car share is going faster than what the Commission is proposing in her regulation. Well, obviously the idea of regulation is that you sort of push the market beyond where it's going automatically. And so we looked at what the cost-effective scenario could look like, and that's the green line. And so we're proposing that the Commission ups its ambition and ensures electrification goes a bit faster than foreseen now, and that we really see a big impact on emissions already before 2030. Next slide, please. So you might now ask yourself the question, well, if we have these car CO2 standards and if they're working so well, why do we then still need an ETS for road transport? Or what could kind of be the role of this ETS for road transport? Well, while CO2 standards reduce demand for fossil fuels in the sense that they ensure that more EVs are sold, and while they decrease the costs of new EVs through this mass production, we still need to reduce demand for fossil fuels on top of that. On the one hand, to prevent a rebound effect from the fact that fossil fuel cars are getting more and more efficient. And so people might also drive them more. So if you increase the price of fossil fuels, you can sort of prevent that rebound effect. Now, on the other hand, because while we might have a phase out of fossil fuel cars in 2035, there will still be a legacy fleet around after that. And by 2050, we need to be at net zero. So we need to ensure that this legacy fleet is being phased out as quickly as possible. And at the same time, we need to enable the lowest incomes in the transition. And the good thing about carbon pricing is that it generates revenues. And if these are spent in the right way, and we'll talk about that more towards the end of this presentation, then you can really create a sort of enabling effect for the lowest incomes. So what you can see here in the table at the bottom is the impact that different CO2 prices could have both on the prices of diesel and petrol. So it goes from 25 euros per ton, which would mean a 6 cents increase, towards 60 euros per ton, which would mean a 15 cents increase. And then on the right-hand side of the table, you can see what that would mean in terms of change in demand, and thus also in CO2 emissions. And if I take the middle line, so 44 euros per ton CO2 price, then you can see that emissions would be going down by 6.5%. And I don't know if you remember the slide that Sam showed at the beginning, but between 2014 and 2018, emissions from road transport have actually increased by about that amount. So this could be a way to decrease them again. And just to give you a snapshot of what kind of revenues we'd be looking at, so for the 44 euros per ton CO2, you'd be looking at annual revenues of 42 billion, which is already a nice pot that you can use to ensure that the lowest incomes are not hit and are enabled in the transition. Next slide, please. So on top of that, we need to reverse the trends in transport emissions, and we need to ensure the 2030 targets. So as Sam explained, there's a cap on emissions, and the cap goes down by 2030. And this ensures that we reach our 2030 targets. Next point. It also introduces the polluter pays principle. So in the end, we want to go towards an economy where all externalities are included into fuel prices. Next slide, please. But of course, this needs to be done in a socially just way, and more about that in a second. And I think this is my last slide, and I will hand it back over to Sam for the buildings sector.
Thank you, Sophie. So yeah, as Sophie just said, we're now going to move on to the buildings sector, which is slightly different, I think, from the transport sector in terms of the differences. So next slide, please, Hans. So just a quick advertorial. A lot of the analysis here will comes from a publication from RAP earlier this year. Pricing is just the icing, which we published before the proposals this summer that the Commission launched. And I think the title gives away, I guess, the conclusions of the report, that pricing is an important part of the policy framework to reduce emissions, but is certainly not the most important element. So next slide, please, Hans. So a bit of context. So heat decarbonisation is expected to play a big role in the 2020s. In fact, a much bigger role than it has played before 2020. And in fact, buildings is a sector that is expected to make the biggest reductions in direct emissions over the coming decade. And if you analyse what was in the Climate Target Plan impact assessment that the Commission launched in 2020, they expect between 2026 and 2030, so this is the 5 years that the ETS2 will be first in operation, 1 in 4 homes are expected to replace their heating systems. And given the efficiency and carbon emission reduction properties of heat pumps, that means a lot of these homes are expected to switch to electric heating. Next slide, please. So let's have a quick look at final energy consumption in residential buildings. Again, this comes from the Commission's impact assessment. We can see in 2015 the picture, and then in 2030 in the mixed scenario, which is the scenario that most that is, I guess, closest to the final proposals that came out in July 2021, mixed in that it includes both an ETS and a whole bunch of other regulatory and supporting measures. And we can see that fossil fuels, which accounted for around half of demand satisfaction in 2015, are expected to drop to less than a quarter in 2030, with coal completely gone out of the system. That's the bottom part of the stack. Oil reducing by over 80%. That's the second element of the stack. And then gas down by 44% relative to 2015 in 2030. What's replacing that? Well, the first thing to say is it's energy efficiency. So you can see that demand overall is expected to fall by 17%. And then the other elements are that rise are electricity consumption, which is expected to rise by 25%. And the green area here, which is called other res, which indeed means things like, well, renewables that are not bioenergy. So essentially it's ambient heat. So it's the heat transferred by heat pumps when they're operating, but also solar thermal and geothermal. And we see that tranche increases by 4 or 5-fold between 2015 and 2030. So the context is that the Commission would like to see both energy efficiency and electrification. Next slide, please. So how can carbon pricing help? Well, it can level up the playing field. At the time of writing our report, and of course how things change, we can see that only in Sweden and Finland, these are the blue bars, were the carbon prices faced by people directly combusting fossil fuels in buildings. Only in those countries was that higher than the EU ETS, which is the price on carbon faced by people using in buildings using electricity. We also have some of the red bars here on this chart represent the future expectations of prices at the time of writing in the EU ETS. This was back in April, May time earlier this year. And then as far as the carbon prices are concerned, we can see that in France, Ireland, Luxembourg, there are some carbon taxes which have escalators built into them, although it's worth noting that in France, of course, that escalator has been stalled, partly as a result of the Gilets jaunes. In Germany, this is perhaps the most interesting one here. We have what is an emissions trading system that is currently operating like a tax. So it has a fixed price, 25 euros, which is will rise over time and eventually will transform itself into an emissions trading system. But I guess the key message to take away from this slide is that if we go down from Sweden and Finland at the top, we can see a line where there is no carbon price, and that's all other member states, apart from the ones listed above. Next slide, please. This slide shows that it's not just about carbon taxes. It shows, using Eurostat data, that when we look at the taxes and levies imposed upon gas and electricity used in the residential sector, that only in the Netherlands were more taxes and levies levied on gas than on electricity. And in many countries, there are significantly more taxes and levies put on electricity as a result of things like feed-in tariffs for solar PV that are attached to electricity bills, whereas gas tends to be very, very lightly taxed or has very few levies put on it. Maybe the occasional energy efficiency obligation scheme might cover both electricity and gas, but those numbers are dwarfed by some of the levies that are associated with feed-in tariffs. And of course, this really doesn't make sense, this imbalance, when ultimately, as we look from now to 2030, we're trying to persuade people to switch from direct combustion of fossil fuels in homes, coal, gas, oil, to using electricity to heat their homes. Next slide, please. Now, of course, pricing alone will not drive investment in decarbonisation. We know that. It's important to get the prices right in order to make regulations enforceable and to reduce the amount of subsidies that might be required to persuade people to switch. But certainly on its own, we know that pricing is unlikely to drive lots of decarbonisation. And we know that because we can see empirical estimates of how responsive demand for heating fuels is to changes in its price. And when we look at those empirical estimates, we find that heating fuel demand is what's called price inelastic. And we've got some estimates here between minus 0.025 and minus 0.32. What does that mean? That means for every 1% increase in the price, you would expect to see a 0.32 or a 0.025, somewhere between those two, reduction in demand. So for every percentage point you increase price, you get a very small percentage decrease in demand for the fuel. And if we just press a click now, Hans, we can see how that would translate into something like let's take a 25 euro per tonne carbon price. And to try and work out what that impact might be, you need to look at that increase, apply an emissions factor, look at the percentage increase in energy price that might lead to, let's say it's 7 to 8%, and then apply that price elasticity of demand. The percentage decrease in consumption might be up to 2.4% if you take the highest minus 0.32 price elasticity. So quite a small decrease in energy consumption from just the price effect on its own. What about if you had a much higher price? Let's have a click, please, Hans. Let's take 180 euros per tonne, so like a much higher price, 3 times the price in the current ETS. Here you'd see over a 50% increase in energy prices and potentially up to 17% reduction in energy consumption, although you really must treat these price elasticities with care when you're talking about very big changes, because really their use is most exact when you're looking at very small changes in price. And of course, a lot of that change in energy consumption, when you get a big increase in price, will not necessarily be from investments in heat pumps, changing heating technologies. Some of that is likely to be from rationing amongst those groups in society that can least able to afford to pay for a 50% increase in their energy price. Next slide, please. Which brings me on to this point around the regressivity of carbon pricing. So while the wealthy households do consume more energy than poorer households, the poor households pay more as a proportion of their disposable income, which is what this chart is saying. We can see that the first income decile on the left here are using more than twice as much of their as a share of their disposable income than the wealthiest part of the income distribution, which is why when prices rise very highly it's more likely that those people at the bottom end of the income distribution that have got the least amount of disposable income to invest are more likely to have to ration their energy consumption. So when a carbon pricing measure is introduced, it's absolutely crucial for a just or fair transition that the revenues from the carbon pricing are used to generate, well, used to offset this impact in both the short run and in the long run through support for investment in decarbonisation technologies. Next slide, please. And this slide really just brings everything together, I guess, placing carbon pricing in a comprehensive mix of policy instruments. We know that with heating fuel being price inelastic, we need a set of instruments to try and drive decarbonisation. Regulation, whether it's of the heating technologies themselves through eco-design or through buildings to improve their overall energy efficiency or carbon efficiency, will be important, alongside a whole set of supporting measures to, from local planning through information instruments such as building passports, to support to the industry and supply chain to help it develop, and of course the use of the revenues from carbon pricing measures to support particularly those at the lowest end of the income distribution to decarbonise. And with that, I will hand over to Sofie, who will focus a little more on the use of revenues and dealing with equity concerns.
Thanks, Sam. Next slide, please. Another one. Thank you. So we'll talk about a couple of options on how you could make carbon pricing not regressive and try to design it in a way that could be progressive. So the thing here to highlight is that while the idea of the ETS is that it would give us a pot of money that we can invest in projects to enable the lowest incomes in the transition, such as renovating houses, investing in public transport, things like that. The problem with these projects is that they take quite a lot of lead time. So if you start renovating a house now or a housing project now, it will take a couple of years before you start seeing the impact of that renovation on the energy bill of those people living there. And also your projects will not be able to tackle everyone who's a poor household and living in a badly insulated house. So therefore, you should also design a pillar of direct financial compensation. And if you just click for me, Hans. So the way that you could organize direct financial compensation is via the member states. So as Sam mentioned, most of the revenues from the new ETS will be going back directly to the member states. And there's different ways that they could recycle these revenues to the citizens. There's two ways that would create sort of double dividends. One way is by having lump sum climate dividends payments to all citizens. So basically what you do there is you give the same amount of money to all of your citizens, which relatively means that you're giving a bigger amount of money to the lowest incomes and a smaller amount of money to the highest incomes. And the way that this creates a double dividend is that you're creating a progressive impact, a progressive income impact, and at the same time you're sort of creating public support for climate measures by creating a positive story around these. Another double dividend option is by offsetting the electricity taxes and levies. So as Sam mentioned, these are quite imbalanced with the prices of fossil fuels in many member states, certainly for the building sector. So you could use your revenues to reduce people's electricity bill by lowering these taxes and levies. And in that way, you also create this double dividend. You're compensating incomes for the price of the ETS, and you're further increasing the level playing fields between electricity and fossil fuel alternatives. Next slide, please. And then the other pillar, so apart from the direct financial compensation, is still the projects. So ideally, you wouldn't have to give all of the money back to the citizens, but you would also have a slice of money available still to do these projects to enable the lowest incomes. And here is where the social climate fund that the Commission is proposing comes in. So this is an EU fund that's meant to finance these kinds of projects in the member states. And what you could do is to ensure that it's a bigger pot of money is actually not to just get revenues out of the new ETS for road transport and buildings to fund this fund, but also to subtract some revenues from the existing ETS, because as Sam mentioned, already 30% of buildings emissions is covered under the existing ETS. And also if you charge your EV with electricity generated by fossil fuels, then that would also be covered under the existing ETS. So this is why we're proposing this sort of co-financing of the social climate fund with both the existing and the new ETS. And then finally, a way for this project fund to be able to have more impact could be for Europe to require governments not only to explain what kind of projects that it will be doing and what the impact would be to be able to access the money, but also to have them come up with a broader plan that explains how they will enable the lowest incomes over the coming decades in the transition, and how they will use their own public spending to accelerate that. Next slide, please. And in the prospect of time, I will maybe skip this slide. It just shows in Canada, they already have a carbon tax, and they use 90% of the revenues to do these sort of lump sum payments to their citizens. And there it really has a progressive income effect, but I will not go into the details. Next slide, please. And this is another example of how you can organize direct financial compensation. So this is a study that was done by Agora Energiewende, Agora Verkehrswende, and Öke Institute for Germany. And basically they looked at a set of measures of financial compensations to citizens that would alleviate the social impacts of their carbon pricing system. And what they designed is a bit of a mixture of lump sum payments, which they called a climate bonus, a reduction on electricity taxes, a mobility allowance, and then a pot of money that they set aside for people who would fall through the cracks of those three first measures to ensure that also they, if they're a very low income, wouldn't experience any regressive effect from the carbon pricing. So member states can really design a set of measures that's best to tackle their population and to ensure that the carbon pricing is not regressive. Next slide, please. So to sum up, you have the compensation pillar, you have the projects pillar. Within the compensation pillar, it's important that people who cannot pay their bills at the end of the month, so the lowest incomes, to ensure that they are fully compensated for these costs of the ETS, and for the higher incomes to also foresee some sort of scheme. This doesn't need to compensate their entire cost. They can be net contributors to the system, but they need to have a feeling of compensation. You need to take them on board in the narrative around the compensation that you tell about this new ETS. And then you also need the project side to ensure that the lowest incomes are in the future no longer subject to a carbon price. But here it's important to note that even if you invest a lot of the ETS revenues into these projects, that will never solve the full investment gap. We really need public money to go towards projects for certainly the lowest incomes in the building and transport sector. And with this, I will hand it off to Sam to conclude our workshop.
Thank you, Sophie. I'm going to rush through the conclusions because otherwise we're not going to have enough time for the questions. But basically, our four conclusions are: to get to net zero, we need a comprehensive policy mix, and carbon pricing is part of that mix. Secondly, this is a point really particularly related to the building sector. Rebalancing energy prices is particularly important if we're going to be able to persuade people to move to electrification. Thirdly, the social aspects of the package do need to be reinforced, given the risks of potentially very high ETS2 prices if the whole policy package does not deliver. And there are opportunities there in the forthcoming negotiations for member states and Parliament to agree on that. And the investment needs in the 2020s, which of course include a lot of electrification, go well beyond the scale enabled simply by the use of carbon revenues. So we need an all of the above strategy. So with that, I will pass back to Hans to facilitate the Q&A.